Bernardo, I'd like to discuss the positive arguments for idealism, and particularly analytic idealism that you espouse. And let's start with what is the obvious thing, that a required refutation of physicalism or materialism, because that seems to be the default theory of reality.
Which tells us something about our culture, right? How can materialism, which is such an incomplete and inconsistent theory of reality, have acquired this mainstream status and have become the default theory? Materialism has avoided being pinned down precisely because of what it does not explain. It does not explain how any one single thought or experience arises from supposedly unconscious material arrangements. And because it doesn't tell you that, it can't be pinned down and disproven. So the key failure of materialism is thus exactly this, to explain how supposedly unconscious material arrangements lead to the qualities of experience, the experience of seeing red, of falling in love, of having a bellyache. And the reason this issue arises is because materialism invents a sort of an ontological or a metaphysical entity, namely matter, which is unconscious and exhaustively describable through a list of numbers like mass, charge, momentum. How that thing that isn't consciousness can lead to this completely other thing, which is qualitative experience, which is not numerically definable. It is this gap between a theoretical inference, matter, and a lived reality experience that creates a problem. And idealism avoids this. Idealism says all states in nature are mental states. We don't invent anything else that isn't what we know to exist. Mental states, which exist pre-theoretically. And all we have to make sense of is of the experience of an empirical world separate from us. That is not a problem. Look, my thoughts are mental states, but they are not in your mind. My thoughts don't depend on your presence to exist. My thoughts won't change because you simply fantasize them to be different. From your perspective, my thoughts are objective and external, and yet my thoughts are eminently mental. The analytic idealist would say, so the world. The world too is made of mental states, but they are not our mental states, just like my thoughts are not your mental states. They are outside you. The world is outside us, but it too is made of mental states. And matter is what mental states look like from the outside. The matter in your brain is what your mental inner life looks like from the outside. And that's why your brain activity correlates with your inner experience. It is what inner experience looks like. And the same applies for the rest of the world. The rest of the inanimate world is what those external mental states look like when they are observed from the outside. In other words, from our dissociated or separate perspective.
So that sounds coherent, and maybe it is coherent, but it is a stunning statement that says that the physical world is the external appearance of the mental world. And that's a statement, but what backs that up?
Everything. Our existence backs that up. The fact that behind the very measurable material activity of my brain, you can put my brain after I die, hopefully, on a weighing balance, and you can measure its weight. And you can measure its brain activity. It's a very palpable physical object. And yet from the inside, it's my life. It's my inner experience. My loves, my disappointments, my heartaches, my hopes, my fantasies, my experience of the world. So even this very physical object, the brain, has obviously mental inner dimension. That's nature's clue right there. And the brain is made of the same atoms and fields as the rest of the world. So if the brain, from its own perspective, is mental inner life, and it's made of the same atoms and force fields as the rest, then so the rest. This is in our faces. This is painfully obvious. And the only reason that it sounds so crazy is because we are culturally indoctrinated into a view of reality that is frankly incoherent and nonsensical.
So to start in the most extreme critique, we would talk about what originally was called eliminative materialism, which dismisses consciousness as really a first order concept, and the word today is moved into illusionism. It doesn't mean illusion that it doesn't exist. It's a little vague what illusionism means. It's not quite an illusion. It's we think it's more than it is. It's reifying. It's making something out of something that's really a minor thing. And that combines with an evolutionary approach to consciousness, that consciousness was some accidental development, accidental in the sense it wasn't necessary, could have not happened, but it had some advantage or whatever, or it was a spandrel and came along with something else. Whatever it was, there was an evolutionary story that brought consciousness into existence. So those are two kind of, well, the illusionism is not mainstream, but it's a legitimate philosophical position. But the evolutionary approach to consciousness being an accidental process of selection is a mainstream position.
I think clearly our high-level mental functions, such as our ability to introspect, reflexively, our ability to metacognize, in other words, to think about our thoughts, to ponder our emotions, our ability to recognize our own individual agency, self-awareness, these clearly evolved. Otherwise, an amoeba would have them. If these high-level mental functions were woven into the fabric of nature, an amoeba would have them. And we have no reason to think that an amoeba moves around contemplating the meaning of life.
Yeah, but some actually say that all life, including amoeba, have some proto-consciousness.
And I believe that. So I go with evolution when it comes to the contents and configurations of subjectivity, which can become sophisticated over the course of evolution. I think our high-level mental functions are much more sophisticated than those of a bird. But I don't think subjectivity itself, that whose excitations are experiences, I don't think subjectivity itself has evolved. And people who think it did are just hand-waving because there is no coherent story, even in principle, for us to articulate how subjectivity could have arisen from something that isn't already subjective to begin with. So I go with evolutionary theory when it comes to the contents and skills or abilities, potentials, capabilities of consciousness, but not that consciousness or subjectivity itself has evolved. I think that is vastly incoherent and a fantasy that will bring us nowhere. And by the way, there is zero evidence for that.
You're very familiar with all of the different materialistic approaches to consciousness, from radical identity theory, where the electrical activities in your C fibers are the pain, just like H2O is water, or the morning star and the evening star are the same thing. You can't eliminate one without eliminating the other. So if you say, well, I'm going to make the morning star go out of existence, but I want to keep the evening star, you can't do that because they're literally the same thing. So that's one series of arguments. Then you see a large number of very physicalist arguments in terms of neuronal circuitry, free energy. There's a vast number of theories, each one having a great passion by its developer, and there may be some elements combining some of those together. You can create the magic.
The capacity of the human imagination to create fantasies is boundless. So of course there will be countless fantasies. That only tells us about the capacity of the human imagination to create stuff. It doesn't tell us anything about reality. No, the smell of a rose cannot be found in my brain. The smell of a rose is obviously qualitatively different from the patterns of brain activity that accompany the experience of the smell of a rose. To say that they are the same thing is a is a form of willful blindness. It's a form of waving away the obvious issue at hand. What is something that we almost grant is that experience almost always, not always, but almost always comes paired with specific patterns of brain activity. But there are many ways to account for this correlation. My own way is to say patterns of brain activity are what experiential states look like from the outside. And of course, an image of the phenomenon correlates with the phenomenon it is an image of. There is no surprise there. But to say that the smell of a rose as I feel is a pattern of brain activity is a form of deliberate self-blindness.
Are you under an obligation in promoting idealism to describe it more? Because those who describe the physical world can describe it in super detail. I mean, in my doctoral program in neurophysiology, I did thalamocortical circuitry, and I stimulated one place and I saw the evoked potential on the cortex stimulating the thalamus. I mean, a lot of people do a lot of stuff, and you just pose that there's this idealism out there that's a fundamental reality. Do you have an obligation to talk more about it?
Of course, I have an obligation to defend it against criticism and in detail. What I do not have an obligation of is to come up with a scientific theory, because my theory of mind is a metaphysics. It's an ontology, it's a philosophy. I do not need to have the mathematical instrumentation needed to predict what my next thought will be. That's something for neuroscience. Neuroscience, which is a scientific theory, should model nature's behavior. A metaphysical theory is a statement about what nature is. What is experience? Is it reducible? Or is it that in terms of which we explain everything else? What is subjectivity? That's what I need to do as a philosopher. As a philosopher, I do not need to become a neuroscientist. I need to work with neuroscientists. For instance, the people from integrated information theory, I work with them. And they can make exquisite predictions about what experience is given a certain pattern of brain activity. They can even tell whether people with locked-in syndrome are actually conscious or not. There's an exquisite mathematical apparatus behind that. I don't need to do that as a philosopher. As a philosopher, I need to provide good arguments, analytical arguments, and good empirical substantiation from my interpretation of those scientific theories, my metaphysical interpretation of them. Philosophy is not science.